Good afternoon, friends, and thank you for joining us for this, our fourth in our series of 8 Malawi-Scotland governance webinars. My name's David Hope-Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, and I'll say just a few very brief words before handing over our chair for the next hour. I suppose the main thing I wanted to say from our perspective is that we recognise that this is a challenging and changing time in Malawi, and many of the themes that we will explore over the next 60 minutes are actually very live issues, perhaps more live even than we thought when we planned this session. We recognise that Storm Anna over the last 48 hours has wreaked considerable damage across particularly the south of Malawi. We recognise there are many more people in Malawi that would have liked to have joined us today, but for reasons of power or connectivity or some other interruption from the storm, the tropical storm, are not able to. Of course, our thoughts are with those affected by the storm. I also recognise that there is, somewhat of a political storm as well in Malawi, with the president currently having dissolved his cabinet and us waiting for further information. I'm sure this is something that will come up and be discussed fully in the next hour. And finally, with all humility and self-awareness, I recognise that there are also challenges and governance issues in the UK as the Prime Minister gets up to address the Houses of Parliament as we meet. But I've met with the 3 speakers today, and all of them have been unanimous in saying, let's go ahead with our planned meeting, all of the view that what we want to talk about now is more important than ever before because of the context in which we're talking. So I hope that's a useful introduction. My apologies for that. And I, with great pleasure, turn over to our chair for the next hour, Professor Asiyati Chiweza. Asiyati, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined this seminar, this webinar today. Happy New Year and thank you very much for coming. We actually started these seminars on the 27th of October when we featured an introduction to the new book, Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi. And the second webinar covered the first chapter by Dr. Henry Chingaipe. The third one was by Professor Hape Kayuni and Joseph Chunga. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series of webinars, each exploring a chapter in greater detail. Now, these webinars are being held under the auspices of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership that has had a long-held aspiration to facilitate meaningful dialogue in the area of governance strengthening. Beyond Impunity is an edited book that has 15 chapters which were written by 25 authors. The book itself was inspired by the unique events of 2019-2020 in Malawi, where for the first time in the history of sub-Saharan Africa, a flawed presidential election was invalidated by 5 constitutional court judges, and where the opposition then won the Reland War. We give credit to the authors who drafted their chapters at a very challenging time in mid-2020, when Malawi was facing the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. We are also very much indebted to the anonymous peer reviewers, both local and international, who freely gave of their time and expertise to ensure that the chapters reach the highest possible standard. It is important to recognize that the core of this series of webinars is a Malawian-led endeavor, and it is entirely non-governmental in nature. Scotland-Malawi Partnership only became involved after the book had been almost entirely completed, and their role has been to offer modest financial support and to engage people in meaningful two-way sharing. So it has had no influence over either the content of this book or these webinars. The book takes a comprehensive critical look at Malawi's multi-party democracy and governance since 1994. So in this webinar today, Dr. Garton Kamchedzera will present on his chapter titled Impunity versus Legality in Malawi's 2019-2020 Presidential Elections Case. Dr. Garton Kamchedzera is an associate professor in law. He is a former dean of law in the University of Malawi. He's also a legal and development consultant, a master planning and strategic planning expert. He's a playwright, a legal practitioner with vast experience on reform, especially child rights. He's also a church elder at Zomba Baptist Church. He holds a PhD from Cambridge University, a master's degree in law and development from Warwick University, and an honors degree from the University of Malawi. Before I hand over to Dr. Kamchedzera, allow me to cover some of the essential administration points. As I am talking right now, please feel free to introduce yourself in a sentence in the chat box. And also don't be shy about sending a direct message to others to make useful connections. After the speaker, there will be reflections from Lord Jim Robert Wallace, a moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, and Baron Wallace of Tankanes. After that, there will be an open discussion, questions and answers, and some reflections. Please put any questions and comments in the chat box. If you are active, you can also tweet through the discussion using @ScotlandMalawi and @Malawi-Scotland. It is important that we should know that this webinar is being recorded as a video and will go up online soon together with a record of the chat log and any copies of the presentation that we receive. Now, let me hand over to Associate Professor Garton Kamchedzera. Garton, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Asiyati. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone this way. And let me thank everybody for joining in. And also in a special way, I would like to thank the editors for pushing me to do this chapter. So what I'm going to do really is just to introduce the results of their efforts in pushing me to do it. So in a moment, I'll be sharing my screen. Just a moment. All right, so as you might notice from the title of this chapter, we are really talking about a battle. And this is how I saw what happened in the two courts that we call the presidential election case. There were the two judgments, but there were also proceedings that happened before each judgment was delivered. And so what I intend to do is just to first of all present my concept, the perspective that I took, and the approach, and then I would like to present the argument up front. And then the types of battles that I'm going to introduce, which the chapter discusses, are of two types. At the conceptual level, and then at the approach level. So I'll just introduce that before I conclude. Right, so at the conceptual level, in terms of my concept now, not the concept of the court and the people that were involved in the case, is that I take the perspective of two academics combined. A scholar known as Niklas Luhmann and a scholar called Neves. So Niklas Luhmann is German, Neves is from South America. Now Luhmann came up with this idea of autopoietic law, meaning that law ideally when made is supposed to produce results that are akin to it or reflect its spirit, then it is autopoietic. And that implementation, therefore, of the law should be autopoietic. It's a very useful theory. Now, Neves looked at that theory in the context of South America and found that in South America, law wasn't really working like that. It wasn't very much a system or a process that was producing results that would reflect its heart, as it were. So he came up with the concept of allopiotic law or allopiotic implementation as something that is very much prevalent in the countries of the South. And from my perspective, I saw that very much with regard to Malawi from the perspective of the Constitution, that the Constitution of Malawi has provisions that are entrenched and some of them that really sound like they are describing the heart of it. But for many years, I think 26 years at least, I did not see the Constitution being reflected very much in the results that the legal system was producing. Instead, I saw impunity, and then I saw mediocrity. Sadly, I saw these increasing in measure in Malawi over the years. And just before this case was brought, impunity was really very high, frightening, and mediocrity had more or less become very much like a way of doing things in Malawi within what I describe as an it's okay culture, where people would simply say, it's okay. If you don't do anything or something, you say it's okay, let's move on, or let's leave things as they are. So on the left on your screen, I'm trying to capture the concept that I had. The wanton decision-making and action-taking without respect for the law and its consequences is my definition of impunity. I'm saying if you have a legal system that has that, and then it adds paying little regard to professional standards or failing to attain average reasonableness in carrying out a duty, then you have mediocrity. And that when you combine these two, it is very difficult, almost impossible. And if you do, it will be by fluke to achieve constitutional legality, which is doing things in compliance with the Constitution and producing results that reflect the heart of the Constitution. So in terms of the approach that I took, I was very interpretive. I looked at the proceedings and the judgments, but to answer two questions, what was at stake conceptually in that case, and how did the parties in that case approach the court proceedings? And so these are the questions that I set out to answer. And as I did say, my focus really was on the proceedings, and a lot of the statements that I use are from the judgments and from the many applications and decisions that were made in that case. So as we know, the elections of 2019 were nullified by a panel of 5 judges that had been put together, and in a kind of like slipshod manner referred to as a constitution court or concourt. That's what Malawians were calling it. And then they ordered that within 150 days, fresh elections should be held. My argument is that signified a unique rejection of impunity and mediocrity in Malawi. And it's interesting, although I did not go outside this, that this was not really just within the judicial system, but that as the judicial system was working, processing this case. There were actually demonstrations and statements and things that were happening, which were indicating that Malawians were tired of impunity and mediocrity. Okay, so I'll now very briefly describe the battle at the conceptual level, the conceptual battle. And the way I see it, and by way of summary, I see that what happened was that impunity and mediocrity were resisted. For many years, they had not been resisted. And more or less throughout the life of this constitution, impunity and mediocrity had not been resisted. Although we did have a constitution, you would find that sometimes if you had a difficult provision to comply with, the people would just amend it rather than comply with it. But in that case, we see a resistance. And there, what you see is my attempt to capture how that happened. That at the beginning, you had what happened in the elections, exemplified by the use of TPEX, but that was not the only thing. Use of TPEX to change numbers. There were 147 complaints. And what happened there at the beginning of the two cases, or the case, if we look at it as one, was that there was a stand against impunity and the mediocrity. Although there were political ambitions on part of the people that brought this case, the current president and current vice president, but the discourse was that they were taking a stand against impunity and the mediocrity, that what had happened was unacceptable. And when this went to court, the court thought this was important enough. They thought the two cases were similar. They were consolidated and then certified as a constitutional matter by the Chief Justice, who impaneled 5 judges who heard the case. And then there was an appeal, as we know. But in both judgments, the court did underline that this case was important, and that maybe it was the first of its kind in terms of its importance for the constitution of the country. Then secondly, you had a stand for constitutional legality, reflected very much by the judges, the 5 judges, and then later on in the Supreme Court. And they did this because conceptually they linked popular sovereignty and the authority to govern, and saw elections as a tool towards that. And that therefore it was very important that popular sovereignty should be reflected, and elections should be not just credible, but something that reflects popular sovereignty. They also, looking at the constitution, recognized that the Electoral Commission was a duty bearer. It was a duty bearer, so as a result of that, taking that position, you can see what was happening to impunity, which was characterized the elections and maybe before that and after that. And as a result of that, they also invoked provisions in the constitution that had not been invoked in many cases that should have had, to say that the Malawi's constitution underlines accountability. And so then the view of constitutionalism that they took is quite radical, transformational constitutionalism. As I look at it, when I look at what they wrote, the academics that they cited and some of the instruments that they cited, they were basically saying, they didn't use these words, but now from my perspective, I saw the view of constitutionalism of the two courts as that which regards the constitution not as a liberal document that just enshrines tenets that should be complied with, but rather as a site of conflict, as a site of battle, where you have society forming itself. And there's a lot of contestation that is happening there. And they saw the law as an instrument for popular sovereignty, more or less reflecting the view of the philosopher Habermas. And then if I was to summarize how they saw the Constitution with regard to the elections, I think their view was that the binary code or the electoral law or the law should be justice and truth produced through elections in this case. So this was the concept, in my view, that the two courts took, which were not reflected on the other side, and maybe to some extent they reflected on the people that brought this case insofar as they had taken a stand against impunity. But because we had gone on for so long, getting used to impunity and mediocrity, the other side took the view of, or the stand of impunity and mediocrity. And I'm just going to show that when I look at the approach. So the battle at the approach level was manifested in some 4 strategies or battle lines, if you like, but in the end, I can conclude that there was a triumph of constitutional accountability. So here we have 2 battle lines that I was able to identify. There was a battle line for expedition, that the case should be concluded as quickly as possible, versus a battle line of attempts to end the case or to actually delay it. It didn't matter. In fact, it looked like there were some of the people who were handling the case were thinking that if they delayed the case as much as they can, then the term of 5 years would be completed. So there were 9 applications and appeals at the preliminary stage made to actually stop this case. And then at the other stages, at the consolidation stage, whenever a court made a significant decision, there would be an application or an appeal. And then there was also an attempt to have numerous witnesses so that you should not be able to finish the case. The court handled that by dismissing most of the applications, and most of all the appeals were dismissed. Where they allowed an appeal to be filed, for example, the court would say that the case would not stall, it would not stop, it would continue as the appeal was proceeding, which was a rather prudent way of managing a case in order to avoid this strategy of trying to delay. And then the second battle line was the convention of burden and standard of proof. There, the side of mediocrity and impunity came with a position that, no, what we do in law is to say she or he who alleges must prove, and that in doing this, what is important is a quantitative test. Even if there was something that was wrong, would the numbers change to result in a different win, and can you prove that? And then that if you are questioning an election because it is very expensive and very complex to manage, then you have to prove using a standard higher than on a balance of probabilities. That was resisted by the other side, and then the court said no, because we are underlining accountability. In cases such as this, the people complaining just need to raise a prima facie case for the commission to explain itself, because it's the commission that is the duty bearer and therefore must explain rather than put the burden on the person who is complaining to prove. And also they said you cannot just say that it's a question of that is mathematical, that if we cannot see that the numbers would have changed, then we do not reverse the decision, because the petition could also question qualitative matters. In that way, you cannot just apply the quantitative test you need to apply both quantitative and qualitative tests, which is the position the courts took. And they also thought that setting the standard too high would be adverse to the ordinary Malawian, that people who would not afford to gather evidence in a sophisticated or complicated manner would actually not enjoy their human right, which is enshrined under the Constitution, the right to access justice. The third battle line is what I've described as regularity and substance versus irregularity. On this one, the approach on the side that was saying the elections should not be overturned, where you're saying that you do not argue on matters that have not been pleaded, and you have to make sure that a commission enjoys convenience in the way they handle their work, and that you can use other materials. So you might remember that in the case there was use of fake documents, altered documents, unsigned documents, and then the TPEX things that we know. And said that that is not important. You just have to say, was this the convenient thing to do? Which to me reflects the mediocre approach to all this, also reflects the idea of saying we can do anything irrespective of what the law says. And then the acting without regard to authority, you had some structures that were set up, agreed by way of convenience with stakeholders. There were constituency tally centers that were not in the law, but they thought we can actually do this. You had the officers that were approving when the law did not give them the authority to approve. You had the chair of the commission actually not approving, having somebody else just approving on the computer. And then there was the question of, let's stick with precedent that the term majority in the Constitution has been interpreted already, and we have to follow that. So this is the one side, but the court's response to that was that you need to make a distinction between a petition that is brought about the Constitution or any other matter, and a referral, a constitutional referral. Once the matters have been filed, then you proceed according to the questions that have been referred to the tribunal. And then the court did provide the rationales for a number of sections, sections 90 to 94, which were documenting what should happen at each stage of the voting and counting, the election process. So the way the sections about what you need to classify the votes, you need to open the ballot boxes, how should you open them, and you at the district level, what should you do? The act was very elaborate in that, and that was not done. It was just a rush towards counting and saying, this is what has happened. And then the court also said that, no, we cannot just allow people to assume roles when the law has not given them authority. We have to go according to the law. And then it departed from a case that to actually say that no, majority means the greatest or the greater. And this can only mean 50% plus one vote. It cannot just mean that whoever has won, who has finished with the greatest number of votes, is the one that wins. So the last battle line was the question of self-interest versus duty-based civic and ethical professionalism. And on this one, I picked up the other points too, which are in the paper, but 2 points regarding the Electoral Commission and the Attorney General. With regard to the Electoral Commission, there was conflation between it as the duty bearer and it as the commission defending the interest of Peter Mutharika, who was an individual in this case. But because he had been a president and was the incumbent president, they seem to have been defending him. And then the Attorney General conflated his role as a legal practitioner for the commission, did not distinguish his role as a principal legal advisor for the government and the head of the bar. And the courts were very strong. The Constitutional Court warned him that this should not happen. And with regard to the commission, the court actually said in future, there must be costs ordered personally to be paid by commissioners if they behave the way they did behave. On the Attorney General, the Malawi Supreme Court of Appeal actually disapproved what the Constitutional Court had said or done about him. They said, no, they should have been sterner. They should have actually kicked him out of the case altogether. The result was that he, as we know, the warning resulted in him not actually arguing the case in the Malawi Supreme Court of Appeal. All right, so by way of conclusion, the court nullified the results on the basis that there were irregularities and anomalies that were so widespread and systematic and grave, such that the integrity of the results had been seriously compromised. And this is because there was non-compliance with what the law was saying should happen. And this happened to me, according to me, because the two courts had linked the elections with popular sovereignty and also the question of progressive well-being. And as I did say, I think this was the first time I saw that officially, as a country, as a jurisdiction, we're standing against impunity. And my hope was that after that decision, if there was going to be continued resistance against mediocrity and impunity, then maybe even the indicators on general development for this country would improve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garton Kamchedzera, for this interesting presentation. Now I'd like to turn to Lord Jim Robert Wallace. For each of these presentations, we have, someone who reflects on the presentation. So very briefly, let me introduce Lord Jim Robert Wallace, of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. He's also the Baron Wallace of Tankernes. He is a Scottish politician who has been serving as a Liberal Democratic life here in the British House of Lords since 2007. He also served as the Deputy First Minister of Scotland from 1999 to 2005, having served twice as Acting First Minister in 2000. Lord Jim Wallace was formerly a leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats from 1992 to 2005, and Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords from 2013 to 2016. Let me hand over to Lord Jim Wallace. You now have the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you were aware, Asiyati, that whilst Dr. Kamchedzera was talking, I actually lost connection. I was able to hear it eventually because David was able to patch us up. I hope you can hear me. Hope you can see and hear me now. Can you?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, fine. Because we did lose it for a while there. But the fortunate thing was I had actually read the chapter that is the basis of this governance webinar, and it's just delighted to take part in this. And it probably says something about me that I actually read a chapter which was about a legal analysis of a court case and leading up to it, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not sure everyone would necessarily own up to enjoying reading such legal dissection, but as a lawyer and as a former member of Parliament, member of the Scottish Parliament, indeed government minister, I found it very stimulating indeed. And although my comments today are to some extent informed by those experiences and the insights they gave me, I was invited today to speak primarily as the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. And when I was interviewed for the post of moderator, when I was nominated, I took a step back from partisan party politics. I moved from the Liberal Democrat benches in the House of Lords to the non-aligned benches. I have not been campaigning in elections, which, if I'm wholly honest about it, was a great relief. And I speak on behalf of the General Assembly, which has not taken, for example, any position on Scottish independence or indeed whether there should be a referendum. And indeed, during the 2014 referendum, the then moderator, John Chalmers, and the Church played a very helpful role in creating the space for a respectful dialogue. But as I've sort of stepped back from partisan party politics in Britain, I think it's almost even more so I don't comment on the unfolding political events in Malawi. But I think there's a distinction to be made between partisan politics and issues which are inevitably political. And therefore, I have not stepped aside from political issues. And one of the other news, as I said, David said in his introduction, which is obviously dominating the headlines in Malawi today, is storm Anna. And I suspect raises a very highly political issue of the impact of climate change, and leads us on to talk about climate justice. And I believe that is an issue which is both political and a faith issue. And I see it as a faith issue because of the reverence and respect which I believe we owe to our Creator, and our necessity of preserving and being good stewards of creation. And where I see this as a matter of faith, I also feel compelled to love my neighbour, and that is writ large, conscious of the impact of the actions of those of us in developed nations over many decades, if not centuries, and the consequences of that in terms of man-made climate change are being felt in places such as Malawi. And that very much is a faith issue and a political issue. And it's important that we continue to keep up the pressure after COP26 in Scotland back in November, that countries will honour the commitments that they made then. And when I had the privilege of delivering a lecture at Zomba Theological College earlier this month, I described how my Christian faith and beliefs had motivated me as a lawyer and as a politician. And as a follower of Jesus, I believe that justice and the rule of law are important bulwarks in society. Just think of a moment for the Old Testament prophets and their clamour for justice. As Prophet Habakkuk said, destruction and violence are all around me. There's fighting and quarrelling everywhere. The law is weak and useless, and justice is never done. Evil men get the better of the righteous, and so justice is perverted. Or Isaiah, speaking about God's chosen service, he will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth. And it is the case that countless laws have been enacted to defend the weak, to outlaw discrimination, to promote social justice, well-being, and equal rights. As Martin Luther King summed up the situation, morality cannot be legislated for, but behaviour can be regulated. Judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. And I've been conscious of what Martin Luther King recognized in that quote, that laws don't necessarily change hearts, but rather Jesus teaches that embracing his message of love, that can and does change hearts. And a former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, said this: love should be the predominant Christian impulse, and that primary form of love in a social organization is justice. And in a similar vein, the United States philosopher and activist Cornel West said, justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. And I therefore believe that the rule of law is one of the guarantees of justice, and one of the bastions against arbitrary and oppressive exercise of power by governments or other authorities. It's what the distinguished jurist Lord Bingham described as an ideal worth striving for in the interests of good government and peace at home and in the world at large. And if we take a topical example in recent weeks from the United Kingdom, there's been concern expressed for some time in this country about the award of government contracts during the pandemic to people who were perceived to be friends of the government. And in a ruling earlier this month, the High Court judge has said that in the case of 2 contracts for personal protective equipment, the contracts might well have been awarded on merit, but nevertheless, the preferential treatment given to use using a so-called VIP lane for companies recommended by those and such as those was illegal. And of course, we've discussed another example of the rule of law in operation today, and that on a much grander scale, and the subject matter of today's presentation by Dr. Kamchedzera. I think many of us here watched with admiration as citizens of Malawi challenged the result of the highly irregular presidential election in May 2019. And then when they took the matter to the Constitutional Court and the Malawi Supreme Court of Appeal, where ultimately the rule of law prevailed. And in nominating Malawi as its country of the year in 2020, The Economist magazine said, the vote count was rigged with correction fluid on the tally sheets. Foreign observers cynically approved it anyway. Malawians, however, launched mass protests against the TIPEX election. Malawian judges annulled it. Malawi is still poor, but its people are citizens, not subjects. And for reviving democracy in an authoritarian region, it is our country of the year, thus said The Economist. And then, as we've heard already today, in the opening paragraphs of this chapter on impunity versus constitutional legality, Dr. Kamchedzera sets out 2 key issues, which in my heart go to the very heart of what the rule of law means. By impunity with mediocrity, the chapter signifies 2 combined senses. The first was wanton decision-making and action-taking without due respect for the law or for its consequences. And secondly, paying little regard to professional standards or failing to attain average reasonableness in carrying out a duty. And it was by these standards that the Election Commission and the former government were tested. And in the words of written on the wall at Belshazzar's feast, as recorded in the book of Daniel, they were weighed in the scales and found wanting. So in responding to the presentation and reflecting on the chapter in the book, Beyond Impunity, a number of issues very much came to mind, but I primarily wanted to reflect on one which we've heard runs through the whole analysis, and that is the importance of the Constitution. It was very evident to me from Professor Kamchedzera's analysis of the presidential election case that the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi was crucial. And when the time came, it was robust and was able to stand up to the challenge of the circumstances. My recurring thought when I read that chapter was how fortunate for Malawi that Malawi has a written constitution. That's more than we have in the United Kingdom. It's not that we're without constitutional documents from 1973 till the end of 2020. The European Communities Act 1972 made provision for the implementation of EU law and Britain's domestic law. And as we saw, however, that was capable of repeal by an Act of Parliament. The Human Rights Act of 1998 incorporates into our domestic law the provisions of the Convention of Human Rights. The Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament are established by statute, and the extent and limits of their powers can be found by reference to the relevant acts, as well as through judicial interpretation of these acts. And even though there is in law a statutory declaration that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are to be permanent and cannot be abolished except with the popular consent expressed in a referendum, in theory, at least, that legislation could still be repealed. Whether it would be possible to do that politically is another matter. But whereas Malawi's written constitution had the last word, when disputes arise in the United Kingdom, the position isn't always so clear. And if I can just give an example, because that tension was brought to the fore in 2019, when the Prime Minister advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament for over a month, at a time when the contentious issues of the terms of Britain's exit from the EU were being hotly contested in Parliament. Now, I won't go into the niceties of the ancient royal prerogative of prorogation, but suffice to say that as a consequence, it means that while Parliament is prorogued, neither the House of Commons nor the House of Lords can meet, debate, it can't pass legislation, neither House can debate government policy, nor may members of either House ask written or oral questions of ministers. They may not meet and take evidence in committees. And quite normally, that happens between parliamentary sessions when one session closes and before the Queen opens a new session, and it lasts about 4 or 5 days. Such a lengthy prorogation was unprecedented and was challenged in the Scottish courts by a Scottish National Party MP, Joanna Cherry, who's also a QC, and a parallel action was raised in the courts of England and Wales. The Court of Appeal in England and Wales deemed the prorogation to be legal, but in Scotland, the Appeal Court and the Court of Session held it to be unlawful. And both cases were conjoined and heard by the United Kingdom Supreme Court. And in the absence of a written constitution, the reliance was made on historic precedents going back to the 17th century and had to answer not only whether the proclamation was null and void, but whether the courts had any locus to hear the case in the first place. Thrown into the mix is the constitutional principle of parliamentary sovereignty, arguably an English rather than a UK concept. But in the event, the Supreme Court held that historically, prerogative powers of the sovereign had been limited by the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And in the words of the judgment, the longer that Parliament stands prorogued, the greater risk that responsible government may be replaced by unaccountable government, which is the antithesis of the democratic model. And on that basis, 11 justices of the Supreme Court unanimously held that the purported prorogation was unlawful, null, and of no effect. And in the aftermath of that case, 2 distinguished constitutional academics, Professor Peter Hennessy and Andrew Blick, published a pamphlet entitled "Good Chaps No More," in which they expressed the view that, unlike nearly every other democracy in the world, we lack a written or codified constitution. The UK therefore has no single text setting out the core principles, institutions and procedures of the system, protected from the casual alteration by amendment procedures and enforceable by the judiciary. Instead, in the United Kingdom, we have trusted politicians to behave themselves. We've long assumed that those who rise to high office will be good chaps, and mostly they are chaps, knowing what the unwritten rules are and wanting to stick by them. And they called for a process to establish a consensus around a new constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom. So I think thinking of that case on the one hand and the Malawi election case, presidential election case on the other, 2 brief observations. In both cases, the decisions of the court, the judges referred to the constitutional importance of protecting democracy. And both cases also proceeded on the basis that they were decided by an independent judiciary. Democracy and an independent judiciary, I believe, are vital for a free society, and things which we must not simply take for granted, but things which we must cherish and protect. Now, so much more could be said, and no doubt that we picked up in questions and discussion. But in concluding, laws and constitutional structures are not ends in themselves. And whilst I reflect that the Roman Empire, in which the early church took root and throughout which the gospel was spread, you couldn't really say it was a model for liberal democracy. But the pursuit of a fair and just society, buttressed by the rule of law, does, in my view, offer an enhanced opportunity for each person made in the image of God to enjoy life and to enjoy life in its fullness. But I'll leave the last word to the prophet Amos in a passage which certainly inspired me in my early days as a lawyer and continues to do so. Seek good and not evil, that you may live, that the Lord God may firmly be on your side. Hate evil and love good. Enthrone justice in the courts, and let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Wallace, for those insightful contributions. Now, in the time that we have that's remaining, let's turn to the chat box so that we can look at the questions that have been raised. And I hope that you've been thinking about the questions and even comments. There are quite several in the chat box, but let me just focus on a few that I can refer to you, Dr. Kamchedzera. There's the first one by Tuwange Kaira. She says, do you think that the outcome of the case will set precedents in terms of case law? Should we expect improvement in impunity and mediocrity in Malawi? The second one, Dr. Kamchedzera, is by Diana Kamak. She says, you said you were hopeful that the courts would continue to battle against mediocrity and impunity. Do you see this happening since 2020? And are there any examples of failures? And I think the third question has been raised by Mr. Luanda. He says, as a non-legal person, my impression is that like the rest of society, there were, well, some legal professions tend to wax and wane in sync or in awe of the ruling powers, leading to mediocrity and compromised legal processes. As a law teacher, how do you see this being prevented so that the law and its processes strive to be of good quality? Let me allow you to reflect on these three questions, Dr. Kamchedzera.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I think very good questions. I was jotting them down as you were reading them out. I think some of the answers could actually respond to the questions, very good questions in a combined manner. Whether this case is going to be precedent, that's what should happen. As a country that follows the common law system, we use precedent a lot. And so you would think that this is going to be followed up. There are certain elements of the decisions that have been followed up, picked up, but at the same time also there have been certain circles, maybe because it hasn't been presented before the court so far, certain circles that have been trying to explain away some of the implications of the decision that the court made. But you, for example, in terms of awarding costs, the signal given by the Supreme Court that in future, if duty bearers do things in a mediocre manner or with impunity, then they will have to pay costs themselves. That seems to have been followed up. There have been costs that are awarded against the former president in another case and the former secretary to the president, and the trend has gone on to say you must pay those costs yourself. So there is some element in which certain parts of the decision have been picked up. Whether it will be followed up if there was another election case, I guess one argument that is going to arise then is whether the judgment or the decision demands excellence, which might be impossible to achieve in the context of a country like Malawi. This is now the kind of like this slide towards mediocrity that it might actually creep in. But if you read the decision, it's not really excellence that the courts were demanding. They were demanding reasonableness, which is basically what the law demands. That you just need to be reasonable and you must comply with the law. And then there was the other question about people pandering to the wishes and the whims of those people that are in power. I think the animation towards mediocrity and impunity is set at the top, and it's reflected. And it's been going on in this country now for at least 2 decades, and people would like to do things conveniently, access resources such as money with a lot of ease. So the opposite of impunity and the mediocrity, which we are talking about, is not something that is easy to do for people that have been conditioned and they can see their leaders actually doing the same. And so I agree with you that you do have actually lawyers that sometimes would defend mediocrity or impunity, or they would want to make things easier for those that have to be duty bearers. This is true. One would expect that maybe what was ignited in that year in 2019 is going to continue. I don't think it's going to be an issue for the courts alone to do this. And as I speak, Diana, I think you did raise this question on whether my hope is sustained. I would say that my hope is now mixed. From the time when I brought this paper to today, even if I look at the practice in the courts, I can see certain elements of the judicial system maintaining standards that are expected from public duty bearers and others. And then I can see the mediocrity and the impunity also creeping into the judicial decision making. So it's a little bit, if I can just end this set of answers to the questions that were posed. Malawi, to me, is a little bit like a rubber wall. Like you push it and it seems to be responding, and you stop pushing and it just comes back where it was. And I've seen that happening now, including from maybe some quarters where you were expected that maybe standards that had been set or the signals set in that decision would be continued. I think the rubber wall seems to be coming back to where it was. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Garton Kamchedzera. And I think given the time that we had, we need to wrap it up here. There are so many interesting questions that have been raised. But like we've done with the previous webinars, what we do is we copy all of them and we send them to the presenter. So the responses are provided and then they are emailed to all the participants. So if you allow me, I would like to thank very much our two excellent speakers for their insights and individual perspectives, which have given us much food for thought about legality, impunity, and mediocrity. And also to the audience for your excellent and thought-provoking, questions. I would also like to thank the teams at the Scotland-Malawi Partnership for their mutual support in hosting these webinars, and especially David Hope Jones for his enduring diligence in ensuring this whole series is a success both in Scotland and in Malawi. Let me end with an announcement that the book can currently be accessed from the African Books Collective in Oxford on a print-on-demand basis, and it will be available from University of Cape Town Press in April 2021. I would like to wish you all the very best, and please do stay with us in another interesting webinar that's coming in the next month. Let me hand over to David Jones, who is the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. David.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiweza. A wonderful hour listening to the views and expertise there from both Malawi and Scotland. Let me add my own thanks to our chair over the last hour, Professor Chiweza, as well as, of course, Professor Garton, Kamchedzera, and Professor and Lord Jim Wallace, both of whom have battled technological challenges today, but heroically so. They've navigated those challenges and they've been able to join us. Thank you for your excellent questions. I'm keen to plug the book, as has already been said. It's commercially available. This is an advanced print-on-demand copies, but with Scotland-Malawi Partnership funding, 500 copies printed in Malawi are going to be available in Malawi very shortly, and half of them are going to be made freely available to learning institutions in Malawi and institutions of state relating to governance, and the rest will be available at a far more affordable rate in Malawi. So it's sad that Malawi has to wait a little bit longer. It's not by our design at all to get their hands on this excellent book, but it will be much cheaper in Malawi when it does. I suppose one final reflection from me, not want to be too provocative, nor make a party political point, but not shy away from the political reality. I think Scotland and the UK and Malawi are facing governance challenges relating to impunity in the next week or so, and I do, with all humility and self-awareness, recognise that so far there are different responses that we're seeing at the Malawian side and at the UK side. And from my perspective, we salute what we're seeing in Malawi, the robust action that's being taken, and probably like everyone involved in today's discussion, we eagerly watch both contexts to see how things will unfold. Craig, if you're happy to put the poll up on the screen, that should appear in front of you. Just two very quick questions. If you've done a number of these sessions, you're probably quite tired of them, but it is hugely useful for us to report back to our funders. Our next session is happening on the most likely the 23rd of February, but we're still nailing down that date. If you're on the email list, you will receive an email. If not, check our website, drop me an email to be asked to be added to the email list. But probably 23rd of February, certainly on electoral violence and democratic governance. And it is our old friend, Professor Edge Kanyongola, who will be presenting in February. So once again, thank you very much to our excellent speakers today. Thanks to all who take part. I saw Patrick Grady, MP, the chair of the Malawi All-Party Cross-Party Group in the UK Parliament, join us as well, and many great friends in Malawi as well. I wish you well. And again, as we started, our thoughts are with those affected by Storm Anna today. Thank you very much indeed.